Hi, my name's Andy, and I really don't like plywood. Apart from this workbench is alright. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of plywood. Sure, it has its uses, but instead of getting a big sheet of plywood and cutting it down, I'd rather glue up some solid wood and make my own panels. That's what I'll be doing in this video. There's a couple of things I want to make with these panels, the first of which being this monitorizer. It's pretty simple construction, it's just got two small panels that will act as leg pieces with rebates cut into them, and then a larger panel that will sit on top. I'm starting off by milling the rough cut lumber. This is old pallet wood, so it's rough on all sides. I start off by planing one of the faces and one of the edges on my benchtop surface planer. I'm then using my thicknesser to plane the other face and take it down to final thickness, which is about 20mm, or this many inches. This process creates a load of wood shavings, so I do have to empty my dust collector a few times. I've now got all the boards planed on both faces and on one of the edges. The next step is to rip the boards to final width. That's also going to square up that final edge. The final width of these boards will be about 80mm, meaning I've lost about 20mm from each board. If you're planning on doing something similar to this, just make sure you take that loss into account when planning out how much material you'll need for your project. After I've ripped the boards to final width on the table saw, I take them over to the Mitre saw and start cleaning up the ends. I'm cutting off any big splits or cracks or large screw holes and any places where I can see the thickness has sniped them. After I've cut one end off each of the boards, I'm setting up a stop block so I can cut the rest of the boards to the final length. This length doesn't really matter, it just makes everything a little bit easier to line up when we come to glue these boards into panels. All these boards have now been thicknessed, ripped and cut to the same length. I'm going to start laying out the panels and mark out where I'm going to put the biscuits. I know there's a lot of talk online about biscuits and whether they really strengthen joints or panels, but in this case it doesn't really matter because this stand's not going to be bearing a huge amount of weight. However, biscuits are great for aligning panels, especially since these boards are already planed down to their final thickness. I really want them to stay as flat as possible, and that's where the biscuits really shine. I've got the first panel glued up and in clamps just behind me here. I'm going to start working on the next one now, which is a bit bigger. It's dry fit together at the moment just so I can see what excess I can cut off it, so it's easier to manoeuvre when I'm gluing it up. After I've got the ends cut off, I lay out my clamps and start applying the glue and putting the biscuits in the slots I've just cut. I'm also using this opportunity to scrape up any glue that's squeezed out and wiping off any excess with a piece of damp glue roll. It's a lot easier to do now than when the glue's dried. I've also added some cools just to help the board stay as flat as possible while they're drying, as all the clamping pressure is coming from one side. I leave the glue to dry and then remove the panels from the clamps the next morning. I'm really happy with how these panels come out. As you can see, they're nice and level. There's a bit of unevenness in places, but nothing a bit of light sanding won't get rid of. However, there are a lot of these big screw holes. As I said, this is old pallet wood, so it's full of them. Normally I'd fill them with a mixture of wood glue and sawdust, but as I'm planning to stain this and that doesn't take stain well, I'm actually going to drill them out and fill them with some plugs. I ordered this Trend 9.5mm plug cutter from Amazon specifically for this project. It cost around 20 quid. I've seen people online use a chisel or a screwdriver to pry the plugs out, but I didn't want to risk snapping the plugs, so I opted to resaw the piece of wood on my bandsaw to release them. I'm then drilling out all the screw holes with a 10mm drill bit in my drill press. My drill press couldn't reach all the holes, so I had to drill some out by hand, which didn't come out as neat. I then insert the plugs with a little bit of glue and use my flush cut saw to trim them down. So the plan to use the plug cutter didn't quite go as well as I was hoping it would. I got a couple of neat ones like this. Once that's sanded down, it will be quite hard to see. Yeah, the grain doesn't match, but it looks quite neat. On the other hand, there's pieces like this which I've had to fill with a bit of sawdust and glue, which I didn't really want to do, but there was quite a bit of chip out, so I didn't really have a choice there. I don't know if the plug cutter I bought was intended for hardwood or softwood, but the plugs were pretty gnarly looking. I'll sand it back and see how it looks. It might not take the stain as well, but it will look better than chip out. I just finished sanding to 120 grit. I filled all the holes with plugs, and the ones that didn't look great, I've used a bit of sawdust and glue to fill in any gaps. Does it look perfect? Not at all. Will it do? Yeah, I'm happy with it. Now I've got everything rough sanded, I can start cutting the panels down to the final size. I'm starting off by cross-cutting the smaller leg sections. I get the first one cut down and then use that as a template to cut the second one down. This just ensures that there's no issues with measuring and they both come out the same size. I'm then ripping down the top panel and both leg pieces on my table saw. Now that all the panels are cut down to their final size, I can start cutting in the joinery. I'm using my table saw to cut the rebates as I find this to be the quickest way. I set my fence to half the width of the leg piece, making sure to account for the blade's width, and raise the blade to 20mm. After making the cut on both leg pieces, I lowered the blade to 10mm and adjusted the fence to 20mm, again including the blade's width in that 20mm. Right, so if all those numbers and measurements were confusing and you got lost there, I don't blame you. Basically, all you need to know is that this leaves me with a rectangle cut out on each of the leg pieces, which I can then sit the top panel into. So these pipe clamps I've got here are actually about 1 centimetre too short to fit this stand in. These are 1 metre long. I was hoping they would work, but what I'm going to have to do is get out my 1.8 metre pipe clamps. I've only got 2 of them. That should be enough. See how it goes. These longer clamps worked out fine. I'm just applying a bit of glue to the rebates I cut out and putting them into place. I've also got a couple of sacrificial cut-off pieces that I've placed between the stand and the clamps. As this is a softwood, the clamping pressure can leave dents in the piece, so I've put these small pieces in there just to evenly spread the load across a larger surface area. I've added a few more clamps on each side just to get a bit of downforce to get this joint nice and tight. I've also wedged in this offcut here just to make sure that these joints dry as close to 90 degrees as possible. I've got it about half a degree from 90 on each side, which I'm happy with. I've left the glue to dry overnight. Next job is to take the stand out of the clamps and put a small round over on all the edges. I'm using a 3mm round over bit in my palm router. This just breaks those sharp corners and makes it nicer to the touch. Once I'm done with the palm router, I'll hand sand all those round overs just to get them as smooth as possible. I noticed the stand didn't sit quite level when I took it out of clamps, so I've taped some sandpaper to my workbench and I'm just using that to sand down both leg pieces to get it sitting as level as possible. I'm going to be using this light oak stain from Little Fairs. It's a water-based stain, which means after sanding to 180 grit, I'm going to need to pop the grain with water. Basically, I sand the wood flat, spray it with a bit of water, which makes the fibres stand up. Once that dries, I can sand those fibres flat again. When I put the water-based finish on, those fibres don't stand up and it carries on feeling smooth. If I put the stain on without water popping, it would feel really rough to the touch. I start off by applying the stain to the underside of the stand using a foam brush. After I've got a coat down, I'll use a cotton rag to wipe off any excess. I then repeat that process on the sides and on the top of the stand.
I leave the stain to dry for a few hours before finishing the stand with some Danish oil. I really like using Danish oil, it leaves a really nice satin finish, it's super easy to apply and it dries pretty quickly. I'm only going to put one coat down as it's not going to be a high traffic piece and that should be enough protection. I leave the oil about 15 minutes to soak into the wood and then I'll remove any excess with a couple of clean cotton rags. If you are using Danish oil, just make sure you dispose of your cotton rags safely as they can self-combust. I always soak mine in water for 24 hours before throwing them away. I leave the finish to cure overnight and then we're done. All that's needed now is to load the stand into the back of my car and drop it off at my brother's house. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this kind of content then hit that subscribe button and I'll catch you in the next one.